You Bet is a really good episode of Everybody Loves Raymond with some really great moments. This is the third episode of the fourth season. It's directed by Will Mackenzie, and as always, there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. And it starts off with a delightful moment where Ray says, "Hey, Powder Puff," which I thought was funny in itself, and I'd made a note to mention it because I rather liked it. And then it cuts to Frank looking in the fridge and turning around, which was even better. Really thoroughly enjoyed it. Frank's there to get some rash ointment, and Ray's comment about how Frank's touching all their food rather amused me because presumably he's scratched his rash. And Ray tells a story about a sports player called Joe Taggart, and we think no more of that. Frank then in the next scene visits Ray while Ray's in his office writing, and he tells him he's a good writer, and it's a lovely moment, but it's very atypical of Frank's behaviour. And it's clear that something's up, something's not right. And Ray actually asks Marie and Robert if he'd been acting strangely, and they both said, yes, actually, he has. He's down at the barber shop at the moment, and two of Frank's friends come over. We are, of course, at Frank and Marie's house, and they owed him some money from gambling. And they decide they're never going to gamble with him again because he just seems to be winning all of the time. And they leave, and they happen to mention Joe Taggart. And as soon as they mentioned Joe Taggart, I think the penny began to drop there, at least for me. And it turns out that he'd clearly been using the stories Ray had been telling him, these personal stories about sports players. Obviously, he's not saying outright they're going to win this or that game because that's impossible, but the stories definitely help to make things a little bit more, I guess, predictable. And Frank had been talking with Ray to get these inside stories. And to be honest, I feel like Frank didn't need to be sneaky. I feel like if he'd just, I'm not saying he should have done this anyway, but if he'd just come up to Ray and said, hey, do you have any stories you'd like to share? Ray would love to talk about his day. He'd love to talk about the experiences he's had. That's absolutely the case. Maybe not necessarily with Frank, but at the same time, Ray is always looking for that father-son bond with Frank that Frank doesn't give him. So I guess the point there is that Frank didn't need to be sly and crafty. I think he could have just said, do you have any stories? Granted, he shouldn't have done it for the sake of gambling, but I don't think he needed to just go to Ray and compliment him and make things really weird and awkward to get these stories. And I liked what Ray did next. I didn't immediately pick up on what he was doing. And then I did. He goes down to the barber shop, and I thought he was going to confront Frank straight away. Frank's clearly in the money because he's paying for a shave, which he doesn't normally do. And Ray sits down and he gets his hair done as well, and he starts to tell a story, a sports story about a certain player. And that's when I realised what he was doing. He was feeding Frank incorrect information. And then we cut to sometime later, Marie comes over and she thinks Frank is fooling around. That's why Frank is acting strangely in her eyes. But then Frank comes over and he's shouting for Ray. And I think it was immediately obvious what had happened. And I think Frank realised very quickly as well. He realised Ray set him up. And Ray explains why he did this, and the team won anyway, which I don't love. But also it does help to show that you can't just trust that everything Ray is saying, because Frank went with something that he thought was true based on what Ray said, so the team he bet on should have won. But even though that story wasn't true, they still won anyway. So I guess the message there is you don't need these stories to win. You might not have as much luck or win as frequently, but I definitely can see that being an interesting take with it, that even though Ray's story was false, Frank still won, or the team he bet on still won. But I would have liked it if they'd lost to help teach Frank a lesson that what he did was bad, and here is your punishment. And Frank says that he couldn't have just come out with it because Ray wouldn't have given him the stories for the purpose of gambling, which I think would absolutely be true. And Ray even explained to him, I couldn't place these bets with you because of my profession. And that's not something I'd ever thought of before. Because obviously when there are stories that are being in print, people will know what's happening anyway. But these are personal stories that Ray has with the players off the record. And that's kind of an insider information that generally other people wouldn't have. So I never thought of that before. But I think that that is definitely really interesting. And Frank realizes that what he did was wrong. So he tells Frank that he wasn't faking it with enjoying spending time with Ray. And he sits down next to him. And I love that Frank was the one to make that move. Frank initiated that conversation. Yes, the conversation was awkward and clunky and brief, but he tried. And I thought that was really sweet and really moving, and I rather liked it quite a lot. And then we end with a bit of comedy because things got quite heavy there, quite heavy and emotional. And then we have some comedy with Frank at his breakfast table, and Robert comes in to tell him that there's a new speed trap. And it turns out Robert was not the first to tell Frank that. Ray had already told him. Robert stormed out annoyed, and Frank had a little smile to himself. It was a nice way to end things. I think there are some great messages in this. One, don't gamble. I mean, people are always going to gamble, but if you are going to gamble, try not to use your son for insider information, particularly without telling Ray. As I said, if Frank had just said to him, can I have some stories? Ray would have shared the stories, but had he said, can I have it for gambling purposes? Ray might not have done. But is that a bad thing? I would like to think that Ray shouldn't be telling these stories anyway, because these are things told probably in confidence. And Ray kind of spreading those stories, you never know how far that's going to get. So I'm not saying Ray was the bad guy here, but I do think there's an argument that Ray shouldn't have told those stories anyway, because they weren't stories to be told to other people. They were told to Ray in a moment of confidence. So there is an argument for that as well, that it's not all Frank's fault. Maybe it's Ray's fault. I don't know. Either way, some good messages in here, but some really lovely father-son moments as well. And personal highlight, absolutely that intro. Really, really loved it. And from start to finish, I thought You Bet was a pretty brilliant episode of Everybody Loves Raymond.